In 1741, the London Foundling Hospital began receiving children. For an infant whose mother could not breastfeed, the urgent question was simple: who would feed the child now? The surviving record points to several possibilities. Another woman might breastfeed the infant. A caregiver might use a hand-feeding preparation such as pap. A child admitted to the hospital might be placed with a nurse outside London. None of these was a guaranteed solution, and none worked through food alone. The deeper question is therefore not just what went into an infant's mouth. It is how a chain of care was built around that child, who controlled it, and where it could break. The evidence includes nurses and foster households, rural distance, inspectors, feeding vessels, medical advice, and the health of children when they entered institutional care. A two-word answer such as wet nurse hides almost all of that machinery. There is an important limit at the start. The records do not allow us to calculate why breastfeeding was unavailable across London, or how often each reason occurred. They also do not allow us to say that most wealthy women hired wet nurses. The sources are selective, and different records use different terms. This story can show the arrangements that existed and how one institution operated. It cannot turn the Foundling Hospital into a statistical portrait of every London family. That institution still gives us an unusually deep body of evidence. Founded in 1739, the Foundling Hospital began admitting children 2 years later. Its archive covers the years from 1739 to 1954 and describes about 27,000 children. A digitized portion contains 405 volumes and nearly 100,000 pages, including records connected to 22,031 foundlings and 823 London parish children. The scale of the archive does not make every individual story complete, but it lets us see a system through the paperwork that system produced. The records come in different forms. There are petitions, billet books, admission registers, country nurse registers, and committee minutes. Each was created for an institutional purpose, so each carries its own bias. A register may tell us that a child moved from one place to another without telling us what the journey felt like. A committee minute may preserve a rule without proving that every household followed it. Even a large archive must be read as a collection of partial views rather than a transparent window onto the past. Fieldes organizes the broader history of infant feeding into 5 areas: breastfeeding, wet nursing, mixed feeding, artificial feeding, and weaning. That framework helps prevent the story from collapsing into a choice between a mother and a wet nurse. It does not tell us what percentage of families used each method. The categories organize surviving evidence. They are not a census. A single infant might also move through more than one form of care over time, so the headings should not be mistaken for sealed and permanent groups. The first major reversal comes from where the children lived. The early Foundling Hospital was not simply a building filled with infants being raised under one roof. Children were often sent to foster families in the countryside during their first years. The hospital remained the authority over them, but much of their daily care happened in separate households outside the institution. The system depended on a network that stretched beyond London itself. To supervise that arrangement, the hospital established inspectors for the people caring for its children. The existence of inspection matters because it shows that placement alone was not considered enough. Someone had to monitor the care being provided. At the same time, an inspection system is not proof that every child received good care. It is evidence of administrative oversight, not evidence that the oversight always succeeded. The hospital's terminology reveals another layer. In its own records, a wet nurse breastfed a young infant. A dry nurse cared for a child who had been weaned or who was not being breastfed by a wet nurse. These labels described roles inside this particular system, and their meaning could vary in other times or settings. They should not be treated as universal categories for every household in England. Wet nursing also existed outside the hospital. Valerie Fieldes found thousands of nurse children recorded in burial registers from the parishes she studied between 1538 and 1800. That sounds like a measure of scale, but the registers contain only children who died. They do not provide the total number of children sent to nurses, and some records may be missing. The count shows that the practice was real and significant enough to leave a large trace in those samples. It does not supply a national rate or a mortality rate for all nurse children. The geography adds another complication. Some nurse children from London appear in rural parishes along major roads, with individual cases recorded dozens of miles from the city. These examples demonstrate that distance could be substantial. They do not show that every child traveled that far. Places with better surviving records are also easier for historians to see, which can distort the map created by the evidence. The journeys themselves are one of the archive's silences. In private wet nursing cases, the records often do not explain clearly how infants were transported from London to a nurse. Parents, nurses, or intermediaries may have been involved, but the evidence does not support one standard route or procedure. A reconstruction can show that a journey was possible. It cannot present a single invented transport process as the way these journeys normally happened. This gap changes how we understand the phrase, "send the baby to a wet nurse." The beginning and end of the arrangement may appear in the record, while the most vulnerable part between them remains obscure. We can sometimes locate a child in London, and later locate a nurse child in a rural parish. We cannot automatically fill the distance with a confident scene of who carried the infant, how long the journey took, or what happened along the road. In some places, wet nursing may have operated as regular paid work that brought economic value to a nurse and her household. The evidence supports that possibility for particular localities, not for the whole of England. This matters because it moves wet nursing beyond a purely private act between two women. In certain communities, it could form part of a local economy of care. Yet the surviving evidence still does not justify a single national model. For children who were not breastfed, hand feeding created a different set of choices. One documented preparation was pap, bread softened in milk or water. It could be used as a substitute, as a supplement, or during weaning, and recipes could vary. The sources establish the preparation and its uses. They do not establish that every version was safe, that every infant received the same mixture, or that pap occupied the same place in every household. A surviving object makes this method unusually visible. A silver pap boat was made in London in 1767. Its survival confirms that specialized feeding vessels existed and that hand feeding was a real practice. The object cannot tell us who owned it, how often it was used, or how many caregivers relied on silver vessels rather than other containers. An artifact proves existence. Prevalence requires a different kind of evidence. That distinction between existence and prevalence is essential throughout this story. A medical author can recommend a practice without showing how many people followed it. A museum object can reveal a technique without counting its users. A burial register can contain thousands of deaths without providing the number of children who survived. Each source answers a different question, and the story becomes unreliable when one kind of answer is made to do the work of another. By this point, the central problem has changed shape. Feeding an infant required milk or another preparation, but it also required a caregiver, a household, tools, time, and some way of maintaining care when mother and child were separated. Institutional children added another layer of authority and oversight. Private wet nursing arrangements could add distance while leaving the transport process poorly documented. The food was visible. The chain that delivered it was harder to reconstruct. Medical writing introduced another source of influence and another risk of misreading the evidence. In 1748, William Cadogan published his essay on nursing and child management by order of the Foundling Hospital's General Committee. Cadogan's text is valuable because it records advice connected directly to the institution. It is a prescriptive source. He was explaining what he believed caregivers should do, not conducting a survey of what families across London actually did. Fildes identifies possible turning points around 1670, and especially around 1748. A turning point in a long historical study does not mean that one year divided an old world from a new one. It can mark a shift in the balance of surviving discussion across several subjects, while older practices continue and evidence remains uneven. The date is useful as an interpretive marker, not as a universal deadline after which families suddenly behave differently. Around 1748, the recorded discussion becomes stronger around breastfeeding, colostrum, hand feeding, foods, and feeding tools. The evidence is strongest among doctors, institutions, and families who left written records. It is uneven across social groups. The surviving discussion therefore suggests a change in what certain readers and writers debated. It does not demonstrate an overnight transformation in the behavior of every mother, nurse, or household. This is why Cadogan cannot be used to write a sentence beginning, "London parents now did this." His essay can support, "Cadogan advised this," or show what the hospital's committee chose to publish. Diaries and objects may point toward actual behavior, but even those sources have limits. Prescriptive literature, personal records, and material evidence may not tell the same story, and none automatically reveals which practice was most common. The hospital's greatest documented pressure came during the general reception of 1756 to 1760. In that special period, it was required to accept every child who met the age limit. This was not the policy for the entire century. It was a particular episode that placed exceptional pressure on the system, and many children entered in a very weak condition. The mortality figure summarized for the general reception is 81%. It is a devastating institutional number, but it is not a clean experiment comparing one feeding method with another. The condition of children at admission was an important confounding variable. The figure cannot be assigned entirely to wet nursing, hand feeding, inspection, or any single decision. It measures children passing through an overloaded institution under a specific admissions policy, with major differences already present when they arrived. Other figures require the same discipline. For the years 1741 to 1760, Corum's summary gives mortality of 61% across the hospital and 53% among children placed with rural nurses. These are figures for this institution. They should not be treated as mortality rates for London, for England, or for all children sent to wet nurses. They should not be compared casually with another population unless the samples and methods are compatible. Even the two figures from the same broad period do not isolate a cause. Placement with a rural nurse was only one feature of a child's circumstances. The records summarized here do not hold every other variable constant, and condition at admission remains central. The numbers can describe outcomes for defined groups inside the hospital. They cannot show what would have happened to the same children under a different feeding arrangement. For infants admitted between 1771 and 1797, the summarized mortality figure is 28.6%. It is lower than the earlier institutional figures, but the decline cannot automatically be credited to one reform. Changes in admission health, selection, administration, nursing, feeding, or other conditions may overlap. The available summary does not isolate all their effects. A satisfying one-cause explanation would go beyond the evidence. This produces one of the story's most important reversals. The mortality numbers look as if they should identify a failed food or a failed nurse. Instead, they expose the limits of that question. Wet nursing and hand feeding took place inside a larger system. Admission condition, institutional pressure, placement, oversight, and other variables moved together. The record can show the outcome. It cannot divide responsibility into neat percentages. The general reception also shows why the distinction between wet and dry nurses mattered operationally. Many children were sent into the countryside. Some could be breastfed by wet nurses, while others were cared for by dry nurses. These were classifications inside an institution responding to a large intake of children. They should not be projected across the entire century or used as a universal diagram of infant care in Britain. The paperwork is at its most powerful when it brings the institution close to an individual family. During the 1740s through the 1760s, some mothers left a token when they placed a child with the hospital. A coin, or a piece of paper or fabric, could help identify the child if the mother later hoped to reclaim them. Not every mother left one, and the meaning of an individual object may now be lost. About 400 physical tokens survive in the museum's collection, along with many thousands of paper and fabric tokens in the archive. Those numbers cannot measure love, regret, or intention. They show that the practice existed, and that some mothers tried to preserve a means of recognition. The object may keep a possibility visible even when the record cannot tell us what eventually happened inside the mother's mind. The tokens also challenge the careless label unwanted. The Foundling Hospital system separated children from their birth parents and raised them under institutional authority. That fact does not tell us that every parent felt the child was unwanted. A token left in hope of later identification points to circumstances in which separation and emotional rejection cannot simply be treated as the same thing. Separation could happen more than once. Children often remained with a foster family until about the age of 5 and then returned to the hospital, although individual ages and journeys varied. The move may have disrupted relationships formed in the foster household. That is a cautious modern interpretation based on the history of care, not direct testimony from most of the children. The records track institutional movement more clearly than inner experience. The return to the hospital reveals another cost hidden by the phrase, "the child was fed." Survival through infancy did not end the institution's authority. A child could spend early years in one household and then be moved back into institutional life. Food, placement, attachment, and authority belong to the same story, even when the archive documented each with a different level of clarity. The original question asked what happened when a mother could not breastfeed. The surface answer is a list. Wet nursing, mixed feeding, artificial feeding, and weaning are among the categories examined by FieldIS. Pap and feeding vessels document hand feeding. The Foundling Hospital placed children with wet and dry nurses. The deeper answer concerns coordination. Care depended on people, households, distance, tools, records, and authority. Each arrangement redistributed the work rather than making it disappear. The comparison with the present needs to be marked clearly as a modern analytical synthesis, not as a conclusion written by Cadogan or any other 18th century source. Modern formula should not be understood only as a substance inside a package. Its use also depends on standards, water, feeding tools, information, and support. The product is one part of an infrastructure of care. From that perspective, the contrast with the 18th century becomes more precise. The Foundling Hospital made its network visible in registers, placements, classifications, and inspectors. Private arrangements often left only fragments. A modern product can make coordination feel more individual, because much of the standardization and support has moved outside the immediate household. The surrounding system has changed form. It has not become irrelevant. The historical record does not give us one universal answer for Georgian London. It gives us several documented methods, one unusually visible institution, and firm limits on what can be measured. It shows children placed in rural households, inspectors assigned to monitor care, wet and dry nurses recorded in distinct roles, hand feeding represented by food and objects, and mortality figures shaped by more than a single feeding choice. It also leaves crucial absences. We cannot calculate the reasons breastfeeding was unavailable across London. We cannot turn burial counts into a mortality rate without a denominator. We cannot reconstruct one standard journey to a private wet nurse. We cannot use Cadogan's instructions as a census of behavior. Those gaps are part of the answer because they prevent a compelling story from becoming a false one. For a child within the hospital system, these arrangements could shape years rather than a single meal. Separation from a birth parent, early care in a rural household, and a return to institutional life at about 5. The archive records that structure more securely than it records what any one child felt while moving through it. What remains is a question that reaches beyond infant feeding. When a modern object makes care look simple, how much human work, standardization, water, equipment, information, and support has been folded out of sight?